Hi, everybody. I'm recording this because I can't be here today. And I'm really hoping that if this goes too quickly or if it goes too slowly, you'll be able to modify the video in some way. You can ask somebody to pause it, or you can probably even speed it up if it goes too slowly. But remember, you're responsible for taking notes on these slides for an assignment that's coming up, and also a group project as well. So remember, our focus is on these two colonies, Massachusetts and Virginia. This is our unit questions. We're looking at similarities and differences between New England and Chesapeake. New England is represented by Massachusetts primarily, and the Chesapeake Bay is represented by Virginia primarily. And along the way, you want to think about how these two regions, these two colonies, actually influenced what America is like today. Start with Virginia. We can see this old map of Virginia, and the most important part of this is that quote from a tobacco farmer. This was a rather recent interview with a tobacco farmer where he said that tobacco was older than the government itself because of the regulations the U.S. government has put on tobacco. Tobacco smoking among teens and amongst Americans is way down, and that's because of all the restrictions placed on it. And so I think this tobacco farmer was pretty angry because he knew that this is his way of sustaining himself financially, and that the government has no right to do so because Virginia was the place where tobacco farming really began, and in many ways saved the colony and preceded the U.S. government. This was the outline, the Lilly outline as we call it. Those are the 7 chapters. Again, these should already be in your notes, but if you need to, pause and write them down. Our story starts at the first permanent settlement in North America for England. It was Jamestown, Virginia, 1607. The date is important only because you want to think about it in contrast to dates like 1492, when Columbus supposedly sailed the ocean blue. And, Columbus was working for the Spanish, and to think that there was a 100-year gap, essentially, between the Spanish initial contact with the Americas and the English should give us pause. That it begs the question, why aren't we all actually speaking in Spanish as opposed to English today in America? And we'll talk about that in a second. But note the date, 1607, and it was in the Chesapeake Bay. That's the area that's in red there. So chapter 1 really is about England's slow start. Why was England so behind compared to other European countries, compared to, let's say, the Spanish, the French, or even the Dutch in colonizing what became known as America? The first answer to that question really is this fleet of ships. If you look very carefully at some of the flags, you notice that it's representing the Spanish. And so the biggest obstacle for the English was the Spanish Armada. And the Spanish Armada was the premier naval fleet in the world in the 1500s. And so if anybody tried to create a colony without the Spanish allowing for such permission, the Spanish Armada would simply wipe them out right away. And the English, we know, becomes the dominant naval power, but not at this point. And so there was a huge battle between the Spanish Armada and the English Navy, and the English got really, really lucky. There was a horrible storm, and it sank most of the Spanish Armada. So in 1588, rest in peace, the Spanish Armada was completely decimated, thus allowing for the English to become the new dominant power in the Atlantic, and also to start setting up colonies. So you can see the dates matter here again relative to each other. The other issue that the British faced was money. they simply did not have enough money to finance a transatlantic trip. It was very expensive. The Spanish, once they got over, were able to get as much gold as possible out of, let's say, Mexico and of South America, but and that would sustain further trips in the future, but not the British. And so they didn't have a lot of money. Even the king, the monarchy, didn't have a lot of money, so they had to find out a way to pay for these transatlantic trips. And so one of the solutions was a joint stock company. If you've never heard of a joint stock company, it's essentially the predecessor to the modern day publicly traded corporation. It was creatively titled the London Company or the Virginia Company, but it worked very simply, and it should be very familiar to you, especially if your parents own any stock in publicly traded companies. It's expensive to finance these trips, so what you want to do instead is break your company up into little pieces of paper, essentially, and sell those little pieces of paper to people as an investment. And if your company does well, it's successful, those little pieces of paper that you paid just a little bit of money for, well, the value of those will go up. And so if you pay $10 for 1/10 of a company, for example, and then that price went up to $12, well, then you'd make a $2 profit once you sold that piece of stock, essentially. And so it was a way to kind of crowdsource the financing of a large voyage over to the Americas. Once the London Company or the Virginia Company was set up, they drew up a set of plans. And I think we all know that once you start making plans, oftentimes those plans don't work out the way you intended. So the plans for Virginia look like the following. And I'm showing you this as an early historian wrote. So it says the chief design for all parties concerned was to fetch away the treasure from thence, aiming more at a sudden gain than to form any regular colony. Typically, I would not read that. I would have the class read that. And then because this is a primary source, I would wait for you as students to analyze the language here. But I'm going to do that for you. So it says the chief design, meaning the plan of all parties concerned, meaning the company and the people that went over, essentially the employees of the company, was to fetch away the treasure from thence, meaning to extract as much wealth as possible from thence, meaning from Virginia over there. And then this last part, aiming more at a sudden gain than to form a regular colony, which means they'd rather basically make money than to create a permanent settlement at all. And that's very different than how the plans turned out. We know that they eventually did create a regular colony, a permanent settlement, but that wasn't the plan. So they would set up a series of trading posts. This is what you get if you Google trading posts. And they would spread it all over the entirety of the colony. They would not concentrate it just in one area. And the goal was just to see what they could get out of this new landscape. A series of trading posts, and based on that, then the following would happen. You'd have the relationship with the indigenous people be good, because those are the people you're trading with. The idea of settlers, no, they didn't want to do that. They just wanted to send over a group of very adventurous young men for about a year. That's it. They would stay for a year and then go home, get there and go back. And then, of course, women would not be allowed at all, because when you put women and men together, oftentimes you get babies, and that leads to settling down. So think about how different that is in terms of how it would actually turn out. Good relationships with the indigenous people, single young men going over, trying to make their fortune for a year, and then coming back, and absolutely no women allowed. One of the first things that these young men tried to do was to pan for gold. And again, I would have the class analyze this, see if they could figure out what exactly is happening. We know that the Spanish had gotten so many riches from the New World, and so the British just assumed they could do this the same, that they were going to get rich right away. But we also know that all the gold in America is essentially in California, so they're on the wrong end of the continent. So they tried panning for gold, and it was a huge disaster because there was no gold to be had. So then somebody came up with a really good idea. They're like, a lot of our sailors get what's called scurvy, which is due to a vitamin C deficiency. So what if we grew citrus fruits in Virginia, of all places, and then we could sell it to England and make a lot of money that way? Well, it worked for a while until the winter set in. And, it doesn't get terribly cold in Virginia, but cold enough where citrus is not viable. We know today that most citrus comes from Florida. And so that was a problem because they really couldn't sustain that type of agriculture. So that became the next disaster. But there was one thing that was very, very successful. And this was due to the influence of their indigenous allies, which was tobacco. And you can see what tobacco looks like in its raw state in the field. And so what ended up happening was this was the crop that saved Virginia. And this is why that farmer was so angry about government regulation of tobacco. But when tobacco was first harvested and dried and processed into tobacco products like pipes and cigarettes and that sort of thing, the king at the time called it the stinking weed. It completely overtook all the pubs in England, people smoking everywhere, leaving their butts and everything everywhere. And the King James hated it so much that he's like, well, we should just ban this because it's disgusting. And people seem to be kind of addicted to it as well. And so that was the original plan in England. But then they realized, my God, if we tax this, if we put what's called sometimes a sin tax or an excise tax, we can make a lot of money. And if you've ever tried to buy cigarettes, and I'm sure you have never done that, you notice how expensive it is. It's not expensive to make cigarettes anymore in this day and age. They're manufactured in a factory, essentially. But they're really expensive because of those excise, EXCISE taxes, or sin taxes, SIN taxes. The government tells you, well, we think this is bad for you. We don't want you to smoke anymore, so we're going to make it really expensive. But governments also become very, very dependent on these types of taxes. There's also taxes today on alcohol. That's why alcohol is as expensive as it is, because of all the taxes that governments put on it. Well, even though Virginia had succeeded due to the fact that there was, the tobacco crop frenzy and successes because of that, about 80% of the young men who went over were dying. Think about that percentage. How would you incentivize people to even come over with an 80% death rate? And there is the Grim Reaper. How bad was it in Virginia? Well, this time, even with tobacco, was called the starving time. And the reason why is because you can't eat tobacco. You can only eat things that you're growing. And it was horrific. These young men would, even before growing tobacco, they would spend a lot of their day. They would get up in the morning. They would work all day long. And they would use their time digging for gold in many ways. And because some of them still believed they could do it. And oftentimes when they would dig, they wouldn't find any gold, of course, but they'd find other things in the earth. This is a primary source document that hopefully I can clean up here. Let's see, there we go. So again, in class, we would read this. to ourselves and then analyze it. So it says that nothing was spared to maintain life and to do those things which seem incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of graves and to eat them. And some have licked up the blood which had fallen from their weak fellows. So the first thing that you should probably get from this is that there was cannibalism, because they tried eating everything. They tried to eat horses. They tried to eat dogs, cats, rats, mice, and snakes. But that wasn't enough to sustain them. And so they started digging very deeply into the ground, and they would find indigenous grave remains. And they would eat these indigenous people who were dead. And then when that was not enough, with an 80% death rate, they figured, well, we should maybe just eat the people that are dead too. And so they started doing that as well. The idea that cannibalism occurred in the Virginia colony was based on this single source. And so many people, without corroboration, thought it was just kind of a story, a myth, a rumor, until James Kelso and others doing research in the archaeology site at Jamestown discovered this particular piece of evidence. And this, he would argue, was evidence of cannibalism. If you look very closely at this image, it's a skull, and it's the jawbone of someone who died in Jamestown, Virginia, back in the 1600s. And so sometimes people interpret it, saying, well, it's just the jawbone, so maybe they were eating, they took off the jawbone. But you got to look very closely at the bottom, and those are knife marks. And there are societies today that do still practice cannibalism, as taboo as that is in American society today. And they use the knife to scrape the flesh off the bottom of the jawbone. And so this is evidence, finally, physical evidence of cannibalism happening. We'll see if this video plays, but this is when they finally discovered that there was actual cannibalism in Jamestown.
Archaeologists appear to have solved a 400-year-old mystery that goes back to America's roots. It's a startling discovery about the way some early settlers apparently survived a very brutal winter while others starved. CNN's Lisa Sylvester has the story.
Yeah, that's here later. Thanks.
They came by ship with their hopes. Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America in 1607. It was long believed that James Fort on the island had over time washed away. But in 1994, archaeologists working in the area started finding the remains of the original fort. And then something even more astounding was discovered last year. Archaeologists say this skull belonged to a 14-year-old girl of European descent. This is what they believe she looked like. They are calling her Jane. She was on board a ship that arrived in 1609. It couldn't have been at a worse time. The food supplies they were bringing from England were lost or spoiled in a severe storm, and tensions were high between the Powhatan Indians and the settlers.
The fort is cut off, it's besieged by the Powhatans, and these 300 men, women, and children are trapped within the confines of the fort itself.
For hundreds of years, it's been a mystery. How did the settlers survive? They had only enough food to last 2 months, just as winter was setting in. A winter known as the starving time of Jamestown. No food, disease, and war.
In the records, there are accounts of the fact that when things were so desperate and it was very hopeless for the colonists that they some resorted to cannibalism. But they were kind of enigmatic references. Some believed it, some didn't.
But now they say they have evidence. The skull. It was found in an abandoned cellar of the fort. Douglas Osley is a world-famous forensic anthropologist. He says the cuts on Jane's jaw were from a very sharp knife, consistent with efforts to remove flesh, consistent with cannibalism.
I can tell you the violence is, in terms of the mutilation of the bones, the fracturing, there's no way that this is just trauma. They have a very clear intent, and the clear intent in this instance is the need to remove tissues for consumption.
This discovery really, to me, has made such an impact on my empathy with the hardships that the settlers went through for that time period and how close Jamestown came to failing. If it failed, the course of American history would be very different.
November of 1609, there were 300 settlers. By the time more provisions arrived the following spring, there were only 60 settlers left. A new exhibition telling Jane's story and the fate of the settlers opens tomorrow in Jamestown, Virginia. Historians and anthropologists, they are now trying to find out Jane's true identity by pouring through historical documents and archives. But at this point, it's not known if she was the daughter of a gentleman or if she was a servant. And well, if they don't know at this point even how she died.
Looks like a 400-year-old mystery, though, has been solved.
I think one of the interesting parts about that video is James Kelso saying, you know, if Jamestown would have failed, American history would have been very different. Maybe. It's an interesting thesis. So, to deal with the starving time, to deal with the problem with bringing young men over when 80% were dying, the first governor of Jamestown was named Sir Thomas Dale. He was the governor in the 1610s. He came up with his own plan for doing this. And I'll show you a picture of Sir Thomas Dale so you can recognize him. He's a white man with a beard. Okay. So his plan was to institute what's called martial law. If you've heard of martial law before, it has to do with this idea that life is like living in the army, meaning strict rules, curfews, all kinds of restrictions on your movement and behavior. So under Sir Thomas Dale, this guy, the men were to be wakened at dawn and they immediately were sent to church. And there they would pray for two things. One would be money, getting rich, and their souls, that they wouldn't die. And then they go work. And then near the end of the day, they'd come back and they'd be required to go to church a second time. Again, doing the same thing. And then at night, they would sleep in barracks, almost again like soldiers. It was very strict living. And to be honest, it was something that people didn't really enjoy. So when word got back that this is the way you lived in Virginia, they weren't getting a lot of recruits. Until this guy, this is the martial law document. Until this new guy came into power. He was not the governor. He was the treasurer of the Virginia Jamestown colony. You can see the dates, 1618 to 1619. His name is Sir Edwin Sandys. That's how they pronounce it, apparently. Anyhow, so he was very different. Not that different. He's a white guy with a beard. But he came up with probably one of the most important changes in policy in the history of English colonization. He wanted to incentivize people to come. And so his idea was something called the headright system. So the headright system comes from the words head and right. So a head is another name not just for this part, but also for a person. So the headright system worked pretty simply. It was this idea that if you came over to Virginia and you brought a certain number of heads with you, meaning people, you had the right to 50 acres of land for each person that you brought over. Now remember, this is back in the day where women did not have rights. So if it was a man and his wife who came over and they had a son, they get 50 acres for the man, they get 50 acres for the son, and that's it. So it'd be 100 acres, which is still really generous. And this was wildly popular in England for people to come over to Virginia simply because there was no land available in England. It's small, and it was a very, very economically unequal system. Most people were landless laborers. So the idea of coming over, and some people did, as servants was actually very appealing. An indentured servant is somebody that would come over to Virginia with a rich guy, essentially, and they would indenture themselves, or they would enslave themselves for 4 to 7 years. It would be a contract. And I know that seems like a long time, but what ends up happening is, well, you know, once those 4 to 7 years were up, you could be free. You could make money because there was a labor shortage in Virginia, make enough money where you could buy land yourself. And that automatically made you middle class. You could never have that opportunity in England. It was almost completely impossible for most people of that status. So an indentured servant would be a woman or a man who would come over and work for free for 4 to 7 years, depending on the contract. And so because of this system, this headright system, we see now the rise of families. Lots and lots of families are coming to Virginia, a total transformation of the landscape there. And so we're going to leave it there for now. Remember, you can watch this video again, you can take notes, you can pause it, etc., but hopefully that gives you a sense of how much things changed and how quickly they did, that the plans for Virginia did not work out.